The next installment of Assignment China, which will be on June 4th. And we're going to air that here in both the main dining room and veranda on the evening of June 3rd, the night before the candlelight vigil. So before we get to that, let me tell you a little bit about, just briefly, our guest this evening and also the show itself. Mike Chinoy, as many of you know, is a longtime former Beijing bureau chief, Hong Kong-based correspondent traveling all of Asia for CNN. He's been working more recently doing a 10-part series on American foreign correspondents in China. We've been very fortunate to host several of his previous documentaries. This evening's documentary is looking at the period from the early 1980s, as early as 1981, some of the people who are posted there, all the way up to the end of 1988. That is before the real final ferment that led to that ended in June 4. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mike Chinoy. Here's Mike. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Keith, and thanks to all of you for coming, and thanks to the FCC for making this possible. This is, I think, the fourth episode of Assignment China that the FCC has hosted, for which we are extremely grateful. And as Keith mentioned, there's a fifth one, which will be shown on June 3rd, that looks at the role of the media in covering the crisis in Beijing in 1989. Can I ask how many of you have seen any of the other episodes of this film? Okay, so most of you know what this is about. This is an attempt to look at the history of American journalists in China from the 1940s to the present day. The premise behind it is that basically the way in which the American media have covered China over the years has had a huge impact on the way in which not only Americans have looked at China, but given the cloud of the American media of organizations like the New York Times or the networks or the wire services, has had a kind of disproportionate impact on perceptions of China all across the world. And yet a lot of people really have very little sense of what it was like to cover China at these different periods, or who the people were who covered China. And so what we've done starting about 5 years ago is to track down as many people as we could find who had worked on covering China or who had been in some way connected with those who had covered China, and to collect as well a great deal of archival footage, home movies, private photo collections, clips from the TV networks, and essentially tell the story of the people who have told the China story over all these decades. And I would like to acknowledge the most veteran of us here, which is Henry Bradsher, Keith's dad, who features actually in three of the earlier films. And in the fourth one, which maybe you'll also show, on the 1970s that we just finished. This particular film is on the 1980s, which is an extremely interesting period in China. It was the time when Deng Xiaoping's reforms first began to take hold, producing all sorts of dramatic economic changes and all sorts of social and economic and political dislocations. The film runs about an hour, an hour or so. And I do want to, I should let you know that you are really the first living human beings outside of me and my colleagues at the U.S.-China Institute who've seen this. So this is really the premiere. And in fact, what you're going to see is not 100% finished, because one of the things that's involved in this project is that we get a lot of archival material from the TV networks. And for this film, one of those I interviewed was Tom Brokaw, the former NBC News anchor, because in 1987, NBC did a series of live broadcasts from China, and Brokaw also did a very interesting interview with then Premier Zhao Ziyang. And the way it works to get the footage from the networks is that the network sends you what's called a screener, which has like a time code and a network logo, and then you pick your shots and pay the money, and then they send you the clean video. And Brokaw's been a big supporter of this project, but the final process is very bureaucratic and involves lots of paperwork, and unfortunately Brokaw was diagnosed with cancer a few weeks ago. Luckily it seems treatable, but he's been getting treatment, and so he hasn't been able to sign off on all the paperwork yet. So the NBC News clips have a big time code in the middle, for which if you were to see this in a couple of weeks, it wouldn't. But I just wanted to let you know that's why it's there. But in any case, it's a very interesting period. I suspect that many of you will either know personally, certainly know of many of those who appear here. And so if we can turn the lights off, we'll get it started. And I hope you enjoy it and find it interesting. And I'm sorry you've got a little extra soundtrack here. Maybe we need to crank the volume up a little bit higher than we anticipated.
We will criticize those thinkings which are conservative, ossified, and which do not favor reform in China.
Last Tuesday in Beijing, Deng Xiaoping sat for his first one-on-one television interview with 60 Minutes.
In September 1986, China's paramount leader spoke with CBS News correspondent Mike Wallace.
I asked Deng Xiaoping whether China would ever go back to the days before his economic reforms.
So long as the people think the existing policy is correct, whoever wants to change it will be brought down.
Deng's reference to internal differences and the possibility of leaders being brought down proved prophetic. But the tensions that would produce the Tiananmen Square crisis 3 years later were at this point bubbling just below the surface. For most American reporters, it was change in China that was the story. Barry Landau was Mike Wallace's longtime producer at 60 Minutes.
To meet the man who supposedly was the architect of those changes, that was a very important moment.
Deng's 60 Minutes interview came exactly 10 years after the death of Chairman Mao. In that decade, the market-style reforms Deng had initiated had begun to transform the face of China. Michael Park spent the first half of the 1980s in Beijing for the Los Angeles Times.
So I was writing economic stories about a mode of development that I had never seen before, and actually nobody had.
For many American reporters then, including Michael Weisskopf, who took over the Washington Post bureau in 1981, the exotic, colorful side of China continued to get equal billing with the reforms.
But there were also lifestyle stories that if they didn't really interest the editors as much, the reading public loved them. And China was a laboratory at the time for real unique stories. We were the first reporters to report the history of the Shaolin monastery, and we talked to a couple of Shaolin masters. I did a story on Chufu, which was the home of Confucius. They were all done for the first time, and so it was heady, fun stuff to do.
As the reforms took hold, it also became slightly easier for reporters to talk to usually inaccessible Chinese officials.
We were able to invite the deputy editor of the People's Daily. We had access to senior officials in Xinhua. We used the journalist-to-journalist mechanism. But then we kind of branched out to the Academy of Social Sciences, which was then newly licensed to talk to people.
John Burns had spent 4 years in China for the Toronto Globe and Mail in the early 1970s. In 1984, he returned as the New York Times correspondent. He met the foreign ministry official who, a decade before, had denounced his critical reporting about the excesses of the Mao years.
The official who with a shrill voice, who used to reprove me, invited me to have supper with him in a smoky inn in the middle of Peking. And I said to him, Mr. Ma Yuzhen was his name, I was always puzzled because you must have warned me 8, 9, 10 times, and it was a pretty frightening experience sometimes. And I told him, I was sitting there thinking there are 850 million of you and only one of me. But why did you never arrest me, put me in prison, or more simply throw me out? I'll never forget his answer. And again, it was a lesson for life for a foreign correspondent. He said, the reason was that you were writing what we were thinking.
Yet the internal tensions, the divisions between reformists and hardliners, which Deng Xiaoping obliquely mentioned to Mike Wallace, were real. Deng's key lieutenants, Communist Party General Secretary Hu Yaobang, widely seen as the designated successor, and Premier Zhao Ziyang, with the support of many intellectuals, were pushing for more rapid change. Others in the leadership, especially some influential party elders, were uneasy about the pace and consequences of reform. It was left to Deng Xiaoping to play the role of power broker, balancing the rival factions in the party. Reporters devised all sorts of ways to measure the shifting political winds.
I kept a collection of pictures of Zhao Ziyang's ties. He started appearing every so often, and then it became majority of appearances, and then all the time wearing a suit and tie. Big signal.
But the reforms Zhao Ziyang, Hu Yaobang, and Deng Xiaoping were pushing still faced resistance.
The policy of the open door was not at all secure. Deng Xiaoping was having to manage his position with the Politburo. So he was trying to hold together a very shaky kind of coalition in the Politburo and the Central Committee, in consequence of which there was a lot that had not yet changed, including the system for the management of foreign media.
Reporters still had to get permission 10 days in advance to travel anywhere outside Beijing, and they were still forced to sit through endless brief introductions from local officials. Richard Hornick, who'd previously been based in Moscow, arrived in the mid-80s for Time magazine.
You always know that they're going to show you the absolute best they've got. And so you need to reverse engineer backward from that to what the middle might be. It was not that hard to get interviews if you were asking, again, the questions that they wanted to talk about.
In one such briefing, the Washington Post's Michael Weiskopf stumbled on a story that would shock the world.
We started talking about births, which was also a statistic. And it was some crazy lopsided number of males born versus females born. It was like 3 to 1, or 4 to 1. And so I said, how is it that you had this odd statistic? He said, well, people in our village want very much to have boys, and they abort or they kill the children at birth, if they're daughters. And they didn't realize that how horrifying this picture was. And I just stuck in my notebook thinking that this is a story that needs to be told. And every reporting trip I took after that, I would have these kinds of interviews, and the interviews became much more sophisticated over time, and I was able to sort of enlist many of these commune bosses in being collaborators, not realizing it.
Fearing expulsion, Weiskopf waited until his China tour ended, and in early 1985, the Washington Post published his 3-part series.
And I had a lot of stories, a lot of anecdotal information from doctors and from first-hand sources, doctors who were under orders to kill children, to stick forceps through their brains as they came out of a woman's uterus if it was unplanned. Stories, horror stories of that nature. There was an extraordinary imbalance between the birth of males and females, and it can only be explained by extraordinary infanticide. The Chinese reaction was denial and how this was a horrible stain on their reputation, and they condemned the Washington Post, and me in particular, on the front page of People's Daily. But there was international reaction as well. The United Nations, which was then financing Chinese family planning, had a fairly large program in which the United States was a primary sponsor. I think it was about $50 million a year we gave. And this was in the middle of the Reagan administration, and he just cut it off.
Still, for many editors at U.S. news organizations, the good news about China continued to outweigh the bad. This often led to tension between reporters and their bosses. James Mann had arrived in 1984 for the Los Angeles Times.
Living in China, you saw how superficial the westernization was. So more and more visitors were coming, and they would stay at places like the Jianguo or the new Great Wall Hotel, and they would come out with these sort of whoopee perceptions.
Daniel Sutherland, a veteran Asia hand who'd spent years covering the Vietnam War, replaced Michael Weiskopf as the Washington Post correspondent in 1985.
I was trying to guard against the idea that China's going capitalist because I was a bit skeptical.
Well, unfortunately, the appetite in the magazine was, you know, the Chinese are drinking Coca-Cola and driving around Cadillacs, and isn't it wonderful? Time showed up with a group of 35 CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, the Time News Tour, and we actually got an interview with Deng Xiaoping. Terrific, charismatic, funny, you know, talked about going to see Marx. Pretty good at answering direct questions, engaged everybody. Really, you could see why he was, you know, why he had succeeded.
Hornick's colleague at Time was Jaime Floracruz, a Filipino who'd been in China since 1971.
Jimmy had the connections, and he could make things happen to a certain degree, but also he had the perspective. You know, as someone who doesn't know China or didn't know China, I was relying on him to tell me when I was going off the rails and when I was making too much of something.
Through all those years, I've collected a lot of friends, former classmates. I think it gave me a little, you know, an extra layer of entry into people's lives and thinking, especially when you hear of, yeah, the Jewish factor. You could tell right away that it's not quite right.
But Deng's charm created a big journalistic problem for Hornick and Floracruz.
Perhaps because of Deng Xiaoping's charisma and his legendary figure, I think just bamboozled a lot of the editors who joined that interview, and especially the top editors. So soon after they went back to New York, you know, they came with a query, a request. You know, tell us why we should choose Deng Xiaoping as the man of the year. So the burden was reversed. Instead of starting with reasons, the process was give us reasons so we can choose him as the man of the year.
No matter, at the end of 1985, Time, for the second time in 6 years, named Deng Xiaoping Man of the Year. Well before the Time cover story, Mike Wallace, the most famous reporter at 60 Minutes, America's most popular TV news program, had been trying to land an interview with Deng. The Chinese leader had never done a one-on-one TV interview.
We promised them the moon, and we said this is going to be sensational. The first time he's really spoken out, the West is going to hear him. It's going to be in his own words. We'll lead the season of 60 Minutes with it. Who knows, maybe it'll be an hour broadcast. We put all these things into the air out there, and then they came back again and they said, okay, well, we've decided, yes, it's a go-ahead.
Wallace had interviewed almost everybody. Egypt's Anwar Sadat, the Palestine Liberation Organization's Yasser Arafat, Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini. But the Deng interview in September 1986 presented a special challenge.
Our big problem there with the interview was, how do you make Deng Xiaoping human? And because for any kind of television interview, as you know, he cannot come across as a theoretician. It's got to come across as an interview with a human being, particularly for a wide audience. So I've never seen Mike Wallace as leery, as scared in a way before an interview as before that one with Deng Xiaoping.
When Wallace arrived in Beijing, he met with John Sheehan, who had become the CBS China correspondent earlier in the year.
John Sheehan, CBS News, Beijing.
Mike Wallace and I had worked on previous interviews. When I lived in Egypt, for instance, I helped arrange his interview with Yasser Arafat, and I helped organize his interview with Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt. Now, in both cases, these were separated by time, of course, but in both cases, Mike came, and before the interview, the day before or 2 days before, we would work together. He would ask me to suggest questions and give him explanations of why this question might be important.
Sheehan suggested questions on problems with the reform process, which was stalling as reformers and conservatives continued to battle in the leadership, on human rights and trade disputes, and on U.S.-China cooperation against the Soviet Union.
And he wrote down everything. And then I was present in a conversation between Mike and the Chinese authorities, including Deng Xiaoping's daughter. The Chinese were impressing upon him, now Mr. Wallace, we want you to understand that this is a unique event in history, that Deng Xiaoping has never done an interview like this, even on Chinese television, and that the historic importance is the interview itself, implying, I guess, that you don't have to ask tough questions.
The interview was in the huge, one of the huge government halls in Beijing, and rather than a normal interview where it's ourselves and the film crew, two crews, in this case there were probably a couple of hundred Chinese officials watching as an audience in chairs grouped all behind us. And so that turned it into a totally different kind of interview. It was really a performance by Deng Xiaoping. Also, Chinese television was recording the whole thing. And that was going to be broadcast across China. So we started the interview going with a few questions, and Deng Xiaoping was very, very wooden. He was coming back with ideology, with doctrine, and we tried to get him to open up a bit.
I sat there and listened to Mike softball Deng Xiaoping and not ask a single hard question. And I could hardly believe my ears.
Mike Wallace at one point asked him about his son, how he felt, how Deng Xiaoping felt about the Cultural Revolution. Whereas, you know, he had tremendously suffered during the Cultural Revolution, and his son had been thrown out of the window of the university and had been crippled for life as a result of that. Deng Xiaoping refused to talk about that. He said, that's not important. And he kept throwing us off. And then we got the signal, well, your time is up. And we thought, my God, the time is up. You know, we've traveled halfway across the world. We've got this interview with Deng Xiaoping, and there's nothing on it.
China's state-run media put out the full transcript.
The Chinese had a totally different view of it. They thought, of course, that it was a great interview. The great man was expressing himself.
But back at CBS headquarters in New York, Landau and Wallace were struggling.
And looked at it, and it was kind of boring. And then I cut it down to 6 minutes and showed that to Don Hewitt, and it's like he fell asleep halfway through, Don Hewitt being our executive producer.
Don Hewitt, first of all, said, this is absolute trash. There is not a shred of news in this. We're not going to broadcast it.
Finally, he agreed to a show which I think had about 4 minutes of actual interview in it, plus a number of scenes of China to illustrate what we were talking about.
Wallace tried to make it seem newsworthy.
Chairman Deng also told us something he has never stated publicly before, that if his government and party colleagues agree, he intends to retire from all leadership posts at the party Congress next year.
in my view, the whole thing was a disaster, simply because we had this historic moment with Deng Xiaoping and hadn't been able to transfer it into something that was really alive and human. I did, I don't know, maybe 100 or so interviews or more with Mike Wallace over the years, and this was probably the worst interview that we did.
The Chinese, to whom Wallace had promised massive primetime TV exposure, were furious. And for John Sheehan in the CBS Beijing bureau, the consequences were immediate and severe.
I was summoned to the press office of the Foreign Ministry. They sat me down and they brought in a higher-ranking person than I had ever met before. He was introduced and his rank was explained to me. And it was like he was reading a statement. Mr. Sheehan, addressing you as Bureau Chief of CBS Bureau in Beijing, and the Foreign Ministry and the entire government of China declare to you today a policy of absolute non-cooperation with you personally or with your company.
For the New York Times' John Burns, frustration over a more general lack of official cooperation, the kind that all journalists based in Beijing struggled with, led to a fateful decision.
I decided to break free and go and see China for myself, defying the travel restrictions.
Accompanied by an American academic and a young U.S.-educated Chinese friend, Burns set out to retrace the journey made by Edgar Snow, the first correspondent to interview Chairman Mao in the 1930s, on a motorcycle.
I chose a motorcycle because it was universally available across China, so you could get spare parts easily. And so I just traveled from northeast China to southwest China, and I learned a great deal. When we got out there into the Chinese hinterland and saw the power of entrepreneurship, of initiative, then you understood the sleeping giant was stirring. As was also the instinct of speaking freely. So it was the most wonderful trip.
Burns had been quietly encouraged to make the trip by his contacts at the Chinese Foreign Ministry.
Mao Yuzhen, my former adversary during the Cultural Revolution, who, again, in another smoky inn over a dinner, I said to him, this is what I want to do. He said, tell me where you're going to go. And we sketched it out on my notebook. And he even said to me, don't apply. If you apply, we'll have to turn you down. If you're stopped along the way, simply refer them to me, and I will tell them it's okay. He's a friend of China.
Eventually, in a remote part of southwest China, Burns was detained by local police.
As I had been counseled by the officials in Peking, I referred them to Peking, and within 2 or 3 days, a bit rather comfortable confinement, the party secretary of the county came to us and said that they had heard back from Peking, and all was well. I was a friend of China, and we are going to organize a banquet for you because you are the first foreigners ever to have visited our county in all of history.
After returning to Beijing, weeks went by. Then, as he and his family arrived at Beijing airport to leave on a vacation, Burns was suddenly arrested.
A man came in to me and presented me with a very formal document which informed me I was accused of espionage. It was very unpleasant. The penalty for spying in China is bullet to the head. And then I was taken off to prison, and there was, prison uniform and strip search. And the prison governor stood in front of me and said, first time I'd heard this phrase, it's rooted in Chinese history, you shall hope for the best and prepare for the worst. And then they took me to a cell block, and they had painted in fresh red characters on the wall opposite the cell door, the penalty for spying in China is death. Fortunately, I knew enough about China to know that this was a charade.
As the Burns case became a major news story, the editor of the New York Times raced to Beijing.
In China, the bizarre case of New York Times correspondent John Burns. He was finally allowed visitors today. This was the 5th day of his detention in a Peking security police cell. The Chinese say they suspect him of spying. The Times says that's ridiculous. No one knows when or if he'll be let go.
I think there was a misunderstanding. John is a newspaper person and just a newspaper person.
Meanwhile, Winston Lord, who had accompanied Henry Kissinger on his secret trip to China in 1971 and had been present at Richard Nixon's meetings with Chairman Mao in 1972, was now the U.S. ambassador in Beijing and was pushing vigorously to resolve the incident.
And worked very hard with the Chinese because, as you probably know from the system there, that once you're brought to trial, you're guilty. I mean, 99%. So you got to make sure you don't have a trial. And so I worked very hard explaining to them the impact of this and made it a very high priority.
In the end, however, it took a personal letter to Deng Xiaoping from Nixon himself, who hated the New York Times but liked John Burns.
As he told me later, leading an American business delegation in the Soviet Union, and he read about this in the International Herald Tribune, he had a certain fondness for me because I had written a story about him visiting China as the ex-president. In China, the events of Watergate were of absolutely no significance to the Chinese, and they greeted him with great honor. So he loved his trips to China. He liked what I'd written about that. By the time he reached Paris at Orly Airport, he was met by, in a transit at Orly, or Charles de Gaulle, I forget, by a diplomat from the U.S. Embassy in Paris, who gave him the message that the New York Times would be very grateful if he would write a letter on my behalf. And he did, which was quickly delivered to the U.S. Ambassador in China, Winston Lord, addressed to Deng Xiaoping, saying words to the effect of, "This is a good guy. This is not, he is not employed by U.S. or any other intelligence agency, I am assured," and basically let him go.
Burns was put on a plane to Hong Kong. For the rest of the press corps in Beijing, the message from his expulsion seemed clear.
This was not a simple case of John Burns goes to forbidden territory, to a Neighbou area and is kicked out. That this was meant as a warning to other correspondents not to travel too much, not to get too close.
Only later did Burns learn the real reason for his detention.
The circumstance which we were not aware of that had led to my arrest had to do with a dispute between the intelligence agencies of the United States and China involving the defection to the United States in Hong Kong of a very senior Chinese state security official. The Chinese did what they always do with a defecting tennis player or whatever, whether they still do or not, I don't know, demanded the defector back. The United States said no.
It turned out Burns, due to his prominence as a New York Times correspondent, had been seized by Chinese intelligence as a bargaining chip. The U.S. officials in Hong Kong were desperate to learn what the Chinese had asked him. When Burns said they hadn't asked about the Chinese defector, the Americans lost interest. But Burns was worried he'd been tarnished and held a press conference in Hong Kong to proclaim he wasn't a spy. 2 years later, a senior Chinese official visiting the United Nations met with the editors of the New York Times and acknowledged that Burns was not guilty, that what the official called bad elements in the State Security Ministry were responsible, and said Burns was welcome to return to China. But by then, Burns was based in Canada, and the Times had replaced him with Edward Gargan, a Chinese-speaking correspondent who'd previously been covering Africa.
My sense of China was established fairly early when I arrived, and it took 4 hours to get the luggage off the plane. It was not an efficiently run country in those days.
Indeed, by the fall of 1986, the inefficiencies, dislocations, inequities, and especially the corruption produced by the process of change was fueling popular discontent. The mode of corruption causing the most anger was known as guandao, officials buying goods at low state-fixed prices and then selling them on the open market with huge profits. Dorinda Elliott arrived in Beijing for Newsweek in 1986.
Back then it was this thing called guandao, which was basically it was kind of arbitraging prices. Like they had started relaxing prices and they'd sort of partially relaxed prices, but then if you were a smart Chinese entrepreneur, you could play, you know, the cheap prices there and then sell at a higher rate, and people were getting screwed all over the place.
At the same time, you had this talk about corruption, differences between the cadres who were making money, or their relatives were making money more like it, you know, the sons and daughters of the officials who were making out well.
To keep the lid on popular discontent, party hardliners mounted yet another campaign against bourgeois liberalization.
So they launched this anti-bourgeois liberalization campaign. So I decided to try to see what was happening, how this was being received in a village in China. And I don't remember what village I went to, but I went off into, you know, way off into the boonies in the countryside. And as a journalist, this was firstly no easy thing. You had to go through the foreign affairs office of the, you know, province, and then it got down to the town level, whatever. By the time I got to the village, I probably had 20, you know, Chinese, you know, officials, Communist Party officials following me. And I remember going into this farmer's house, and I'm trying to have a conversation with this farmer in Chinese, but in the meantime, you know, like 15 or 20 government officials come into this tiny little house with me, and the entire village is basically looking through the window into the house. The family of farmers are totally terrified, have no idea what's going on. So I turn to this woman and I say, so tell me, you know, what do you think about the bourgeois liberalization campaign and you know, what's going on? And she says, she looks absolutely terrified, doesn't know what to say, and she says, well, the reason that we're supposed to support bourgeois liberalization is because, and you could see the officials saying, no, 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 you're supposed to, you know, you're supposed to be opposing bourgeois liberalization. And, you know, I felt like, oh my God, what have I done to this poor farmer?
In December of 1986, student demonstrations broke out in Shanghai.
CBS News correspondent John Sheehan is there. The demonstrations are the biggest public upheaval in China since the Cultural Revolution of the 60s and 70s.
Flew down to Shanghai, students marching in the street, very jubilant, kids with no sense of even the possibility of danger toward them in any respect, that they felt that they had command of the story, command of their lives, of their futures, and of where China should go. I mean, there was an absolute explosions of confidence that they were going to change China.
Many of the students had been inspired by Fang Li-jie, an astrophysicist at a provincial university and an outspoken advocate of human rights and intellectual freedom.
We first knew about this phenomenon of Fang Li-jie when he was down at the, what was it, the Hefei, yeah, the University of Science and Technology at Hefei. And we heard that he was having these kind of salons with the students, and the students were, you know, in love with him.
Kind of an amazingly courageous man. I mean, he was basically just telling you what he thought, and he thought they needed reform.
The demands for more freedom and democracy could produce exactly the opposite effect.
It did start with the students, but it wasn't too long before some of the workers, some of the union members were very sympathetic toward the students and were supporting them.
I remember at that time thinking, wow, I mean, how could they possibly have pulled it off? Or how, you know, how come the authorities didn't try to stop it? Because even then, the conventional wisdom was you can't do it. It was the genie inside the bottle, that you cannot engage in public protests.
The reason was the leadership was divided. Party chief Hu Yaobang, a supporter of greater openness, resisted pressure from Deng Xiaoping and other party elders to crack down on the students. On New Year's Eve, the demonstration spread to the capital, especially Beijing University, Beida.
A group of us rather bravely decided that we were going to have a New Year's party at someone's house. That was thrown into complete chaos because we had the protests were going on in Beida, so everybody got in their cars and were rushing out to Beida. I brought a bottle of champagne because I thought, you know, everybody had been working around the clock, it'd be fun. We all sat around after we'd done a lot of interviews, as the clock ticked toward midnight. We all went back to the car, sat on freezing ourselves to death, and had a little bit of champagne, and went back to work.
Soon after, the authorities struck back.
The party responded by kicking out of the party Fang Li-jie, leading dissident, Liu Binyan, dissident journalist, and so on. And I heard this as a rumor. I called a friend who was working at the People's Daily compound, which included several other papers too. And I called her and I said, would you have time for tea later today? And she said, oh, I'm busy late in the afternoon. I said, well, would you have time maybe for lunch? And she said, can't do it then. Dinner? And she said, just ask what you want. Tell me what you want to know over the phone. You foreigners, you're always so paranoid. And so I told her I heard that Fang Li-jie and Liu Binyan had just been kicked out of the party. And she said, I haven't heard that. And about, I don't know, half hour later, the phone rings. And she has called back and she said, what you heard is true, which is what I needed to report the story, as I did. And whenever next time I saw her, whether it was 2 weeks or a month later, she said, you're right about the telephones. I was called in and admonished for talking to you.
The same week, Hu Yaobang was removed as Communist Party chief.
You could see demonstrations in '86. You could see people pushing the envelope. As a result, Hu Yaobang was sacked by Deng Xiaoping because he was party secretary, to take the blame for this.
Without any doubt, it marked a sort of moment in which the brakes were being applied very strenuously to any drift toward liberalization, political liberalization. It wasn't clear at all what the consequences were going to be for economic policy.
Later in the year, Hu would be replaced as party chief by Zhao Ziyang, also a reformer.
He was not only a reformist, I mean, he was the leader of the reformists. I mean, Deng may have set, in overall terms, the general course. Zhao Ziyang is the guy who did it. Zhao Ziyang is the guy who went out and did the reforms in the countryside.
Although Zhao was forced to share some authority with the conservative Li Peng, who was soon named prime minister, economic liberalization continued. Adi Ignatius, who was married to Newsweek's Dorinda Elliott, arrived for the Wall Street Journal in early 1987.
China had begun the first significant economic reforms. They were obviously leading to an opening up in the economy.
I was talking to as many people as I could, and one of them was an executive from IBM who kept talking about, China being the growing market and how, geez, if he didn't say exactly these words, but if everyone in China bought one IBM, and so on.
As Western investors began to pour in, social liberalization accelerated as well. In mid-1987, I opened the CNN Bureau. There was this sense that things were opening up, that the state's control over people's lives was easing. So we did stories about the earliest discos. We did stories about foreign business people coming to China, about this growing curiosity about connecting with the outside world. It was a really hopeful time. The CNN camera woman was Cindy Strand.
One of the first stories we covered, it was the first ever makeup exhibition in China. And this was held in this exhibition center. And the young women, mostly still then in pigtails and a lot of the mouse suits, they broke down the doors to get in because they wanted a different kind of face. They wanted to experiment with makeup, and they wanted to look pretty, and they wanted to have what people in the West had.
Good evening from the Forbidden City in the heart of Beijing.
In October 1987, the Chinese allowed NBC News to anchor a week of live programming from Beijing. The theme was Changing China.
So things were changing, and I'd like to say that I could see the scope of the change. Nobody could have imagined what they were going to be able to do as quickly as they did it. No one could have imagined that.
The highlight of NBC's programming was an interview Brokaw was granted with Zhao Ziyang, about to be formally named Communist Party chief, and which aired on NBC's Sunday talk show, Meet the Press.
We will criticize those thinkings which are conservative, ossified, and which do not favor reform in China.
In that interview, he was talking about how we have to provide economic opportunity for the young people. It was not just the theology of Maoism.
China scholar and journalist Orville Schell and his Chinese wife had helped NBC arrange the Zhao interview.
He talked for an hour, totally unscripted, and not only did he talk for an hour, but he was drinking beer the whole time. He had a couple of bottles of beer beside him.
When the camera would cut to me, they knew that, and he would have a drink, and then they would replace it. I think he drank 2 quarts of beer during the course of the interview. But he was very candid, and he was not pandering to the American audience. He was describing who they were and why they were.
It was, you know, this moment where you could see belief that maybe China was going to kind of join the world as we knew it, politically as well as economically.
Yet at almost the same time that NBC was broadcasting from China, violent protests against Chinese rule broke out in Tibet.
It was a significant challenge to Chinese rule in Tibet, and monks were protesting and rioting, and a lot of us got out there. And so we all decided we just violated a very clear rule that we weren't supposed to go to Tibet, not with official permission.
They tried to keep control of us, but we spread out very quickly throughout the city. We stayed, in those days there was only really one hotel, or certainly there was the hotel where they could eavesdrop on us, called the Holiday Inn. And we went out and interviewed monks who were extremely unhappy, and monks were shot, and there were enormous protests by the Tibetans against Chinese occupation for several days.
One of those who did not go to Lhasa immediately was Adi Ignatius's wife, Dorinda Elliott.
I'm sitting in Beijing, I'm the Newsweek bureau chief, and we get word on a Tuesday that the monks in Tibet are protesting, and I guess that there's been a crackdown. And it's a Tuesday, and the reason this is important for me is because I work for a weekly magazine, and the weekly cycle is the end of the week is Saturday. Okay, so Tuesday is very much towards the beginning of the week. So I get in touch with my editors in New York and say, this is incredible, this is a big story, you know, I've got to go. So they said, well, you know, I don't know, it's early in the week, let's see how the story develops. And, you know, we'll see.
One of those who did make it to Tibet that week was Raymond Burkhart, the political counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing.
At the airport, there were no hotel buses. And so we had to just take, you know, sort of a regular bus to get into town, which was a good break, because the regular bus came right into, didn't go directly to the airport. It first came into the center of the city, and that's where everything was happening. You know, and so we actually saw, you know, demonstrators throwing rocks at police, and we didn't see anybody. We didn't see any firing at that point, but you know, definitely a lot of rocks being thrown.
The continued trouble finally piqued the interest of Dorinda Elliott's bosses at Newsweek.
They read about it in the New York Times, and they start saying to me, oh my God, you know, Dinda, get yourself to Lhasa.
Meanwhile, as the protests there continued, the Chinese authorities ordered the American reporters in Lhasa to leave.
And the Chinese brought in the military, and then they decided to throw all of us out before we could see and report on what they were going to do to the Tibetans.
A very memorable occasion in which the press was all summoned to a meeting. We were able to witness them telling the press how wrong it was for them to be there because they hadn't followed the rules in terms of applying 10 days ahead of time, and they had some other arguments too. So I remember that, of course, it was a loud and contentious session. I remember speaking up on behalf of the press without accomplishing a thing, of course.
Meanwhile, Dorinda Elliott had made her way to Chengdu in Sichuan province, where she bumped into the Washington Post Dan Sutherland, who was also trying to get to Lhasa.
I go to the China Travel Service office in Chengdu. It's a Thursday, and they at that point have just stopped. They have just declared martial law in Tibet, and they have stopped selling tickets to Lhasa. And I'm thinking, holy shit, I have to get myself to Lhasa. You know, since I'm on my way, I've got to get there. So I'm standing at the window and I see these two kind of hippies literally right in front of me who have just gotten tickets to Lhasa just before they stopped selling them. And I said to them, I'll pay you 3 times what you just paid for these tickets if you'll give them to me. And I swear to God, they said to each other, well, I guess we could go to Greece instead. So they went off to Greece. I get these 2 tickets, which, mind you, do not have my name on them or Dan Sutherland's name on them, and they've declared martial law in Lhasa.
That night, the journalists being expelled from Lhasa were confined to the Holiday Inn.
When you're confined to a hotel, there's not much you can do except have a party. So I had a big party in the room that I was staying in, and Ray Burkhardt came, and a guy who was in the consulate in Chengdu showed up. So there were a couple of U.S. Embassy people there. And the rest of us were the reporters. And you open the door, and all down the hall are scattered these Chinese plainclothes security guys.
People had a good time that night. There was a lot of drinking and revelry. And something happened with Eddie Gargan.
The security guys tried to come into the room where we were having this party. We were all eating. You know, in those days, there was yak and there was yak to eat, and that's what we ate. And so we had yak snacks and yak burgers and beer and whatever we could get our hands on at the Holiday Inn. And these security guys tried to break into the room, and we pushed them out. And that I was regarded as having instigated the unhappiness, the unpleasant moment. I was taken away by the security services and interrogated for a couple hours.
I was summoned by a high-ranking official of the Tibetan so-called autonomous region to a meeting in order to protest to me the behavior of my citizen, Mr. Gargan. And I took that on board and sort of gave nothing back in terms of any promises or anything.
The next morning, as the reporters waited at Lhasa Airport to leave, Dorinda Elliott and Dan Sutherland got off the plane from Chengdu.
We arrive in Lhasa, and literally the journalists who have been expelled the night before are walking, they're getting on the same plane to leave. I mean, I could see the journalists across the tarmac. And somebody had said to Dan and me, if you do anything, don't go to the Holiday Inn. The Holiday Inn was the one hotel where all the journalists were staying. Do not go there because you will be expelled immediately. So Dan and I, the 2 of us went to, found some hippies and went to a place called the Yak Hotel, where we stayed, and we shared a room that was, my memory is that it was like 2 or 3 stories on the 2nd or 3rd floor. And the room, my memory is that it had a hole in the floor, and that basically was the toilet.
Elliott spent 1 day in Lhasa interviewing dissident monks.
At this point, my head, I thought my head was going to explode because of altitude sickness. We've been on bicycles, so our 1 day in Lhasa. But there was a flight out the next morning. And so the next morning, we were in Lhasa for 1 day, and we flew out to Chengdu the next morning, and I managed to get the story to these jerks in New York who had said to me, oh, we're just, this story doesn't look that interesting, but then said, get yourself to Lhasa.
Shortly before the protests in Lhasa broke out, NBC's Tom Brokaw had been allowed to visit Tibet to do a piece to be aired during the network's China Week.
I had taken into Tibet postcards of the Dalai Lama, and they had said that he has no standing here anymore, and I walked around counterclockwise. The pilgrims come clockwise, and I had a camera crew behind me, and I would just take out a postcard and hold it up, and they would fall to their knees, get very emotional and weep. Well, they caught on to that quickly, and we got thrown out.
Then Brokaw went to India to interview the Dalai Lama before returning to China for NBC's planned week of programming.
All hell broke loose. They said I've got it all wrong, I violated what the arrangement was, I wasn't playing by the rules. If you run that, even after I got back, I was called to the embassy in Washington, and I didn't have to write a paper or anything, but they wanted to, and the ambassador's wife took my wife's side, and he said, Tom, Mr. Brokaw got that all wrong. Mary said, have you been to Tibet, to the ambassador's wife? She said, never, I never have. Mary said, well, I was there with him. I don't think you get it wrong.
At that time, reporters for newspapers, magazines, and the networks had the ability, if they could get permission from the Chinese, to travel. But the wire services, the Associated Press and United Press International, faced different pressures. Kathy Wilhelm joined the AP Bureau in 1987.
AP itself made it difficult for you to get out because they wanted you to be constantly on top of everything. So there was a certain fear at leaving the Xinhua machine. You know, so, oh my gosh, are we going to actually unstaff the office and all go out and commit news and leave the Xinhua wire unattended? And what if it comes up with the announcement that Deng Xiaoping has died? And he didn't actually die until February of '97. But the whole time I was there was this idea that, you know, if we could have had somebody 24 hours in that office watching the Xinhua machine for news of Deng's death. So that made it hard to get out.
Scott Savitt was a young reporter for UPI.
I lived in the UPI office, so I was never, I'm not saying that I literally, my apartment was in the office, so I never left the office.
Terrell Jones, whose mother was Chinese, was based in the AP's Tokyo bureau, but spent much of his time in Beijing.
The AP was kind of a vacuum cleaner for the news of the day, you know, going through all the local papers, watching the evening newscasts all the time, and then writing up stories from these sources and from ministry declarations that were not things that others might do on their own. But our work definitely appeared in a lot of other people's eventual stories.
I had a couple of friends who worked for the wires, and fortunately I would keep in touch with them because they often were getting stuff that we couldn't get right away. They were sort of the frontline troops slogging it out.
In October of 1987, the Chinese Communist Party held its 13th Party Congress. For the first time, some of the proceedings were open to the foreign press. This was the first time they'd ever opened up a party congress to the international media. I'd been in China as a student on my first trip in 1973 when the 10th Party Congress was held, and no one even knew that it had taken place until they announced the results afterwards. But this time they had a press center, they gave press briefings, we were allowed in to see some of the opening ceremony, the closing ceremony, a lot of the key moments. So it became a kind of important symbol of China's move towards growing openness.
Our driver drove me down to the Great Hall of the People to pick up the copy of the text of the work report that Zhao Ziyang delivered. And then at the appointed moment they released the text, the hard text, and we all grabbed them. And I ran out. This is really old-fashioned journalism, right? There's no cell phone, no uplink, right? I ran out, hopped in the car, he drives me back. I'm, reading and translating and everything and mentally composing. I run into the bureau, I start writing, bam, leads, first ads, all that stuff, and then we do the write-through and everything. And
after the political upheavals earlier in the year, Zhao Ziyang appeared to be setting a clear course for accelerated reform.
In Zhao's work report, he had called for political reforms to match the economic reforms. It was a huge boost to reform, and it came on the backdrop of the prior winter, them having put down, obviously not so violently, student protests and calls for reform. So it flipped people's perceptions of where China was going.
What I remember mostly about the 13th Party Congress, of course, was the famous press conference afterwards.
We waited inside this big part of the Great Hall of the People. Remarkably, Zhao Ziyang, the newly elected General Secretary, came out, followed by an interpreter and the other top officials. We had our tape recorders and all that, and he started to answer some questions.
It was one of those moments, those rare moments when you really see a Chinese leader relaxed. I'm not sure if there's another comparable moment in with Westerners, with Western journalists.
A lot of us were struck by how different this felt. We knew a little bit about Zhao, and we knew about his reputation as a relative liberal, as an economic reformer. But here he was with this kind of ease in this international spotlight. It was hard not to think, based on these atmospherics, that maybe this was a new group that that was in place to change China significantly.
I think '88 was the most open year that I ever, was able to observe while I was there, which was really exciting because did stories on art and music and things changing, and people talking about sex more than they ever were able to before. People trying out jobs, experiments going on, and some opening up in the media.
In 1988, John Pomfret, who 6 years before had been a student at Nanjing University, joined the Beijing bureau of the Associated Press.
1988 was an incredibly exciting time in China. So you had the first nude art exhibition at the Central Academy of Fine Arts. And there were these sort of series of bizarre events pretty much every week. Something would just happen. The Chinese would call them a shi, just a thing that would happen. And so there was this palpable feeling that some type of change was going to happen very quickly.
They didn't want to do art in the traditional ways. They didn't want to do the giant mountains with the fog and the pagodas and the temples. They wanted to take, Salvador Dali and break it and do a funny, picture of Chairman Mao like Andy Warhol would have done. That West was coming in, and art and music, and it was just a whole different thing that was going on there.
An art exhibition that took place summed up everything that was happening in China, which was basically that people felt like they could do stuff they could never do before. So suddenly, the government somehow gave permission for these kind of wacky young artists to take over one of the primary art galleries in the capital and have this sort of insane display of new, provocative, politically challenging, and weird performance art.
In this fevered atmosphere, Betty Bao Lord, wife of U.S. Ambassador Winston Lord and a successful novelist, became an important link between Americans and China's increasingly disaffected artists and intellectuals.
There was more discussion of reform and opening there in many ways, and we did a lot of that at our embassy, particularly my wife, who had great access as a writer to the cultural and academic and reform communities.
Betty Bao Lord was very helpful because she had this sort of salon where she was inviting writers and artists to come in, and through her I met a number of really top-notch intellectuals and artists.
She just knew the artists and the intellectuals, and they would have these events at the embassy, and she was a connector. She would go out of her way to try to introduce you. If she liked you, she'd go out of her way to try to introduce you to interesting Chinese intellectuals. And that was a pretty amazing thing for an ambassador's wife to do.
UPI's Scott Savitt had a special connection with the Lords.
My girlfriend, Dee Dee Huang, was Betty Lord's secretary. I played tennis with Ambassador Lord and Mrs. Lord pretty much every day. So those were my sources of information. We got treated like their children, so we just hung out in that residence. It was a salon. They would have everything from General Zhang Zhen to Minister of Culture Ying Rocheng, Cao Yu the playwright. I attended all of them, mostly like helping clean up in the kitchen.
In the summer of 1988, China Central Television aired a documentary called River Elegy. It was a provocative critique of China's traditional, conservative, inward-looking culture, a call for more openness and greater reform.
I do remember this phenomenon of this television series called River Elegy, called Heshang, which showed on CCTV, and suddenly everybody was talking about it. The intellectuals were talking about it. And what it was basically, it was this group of kind of cutting-edge, almost underground intellectuals led by a guy named Su Xiaokang, who basically studied Chinese culture and Chinese civilization and determined that it was all basically based on feudalism. Obviously, this was like dynamite. It was incredibly amazing that it was shown on Chinese television. So that was a sign of something. We journalists couldn't really figure out what that meant, like which faction or how did it appear on Chinese television.
River Elegy sparked enormous interest among Chinese intellectuals and heightened the tension between reformers and hardliners. And it did so at a time when discontent over the state of the economy was growing, triggered by moves to eliminate long-standing price controls, which set off panic buying and bank runs.
there was inflation and there was panic buying of some things, of some foodstuffs. So I do remember that.
As the economy started to go sour, you know, that was something you could report. I mean, you could go to stores, you could see the prices, you could talk to people who were shopping, and they were willing to talk to you in a straightforward way about how they felt about what was happening in the economy.
As social tension mounted, conservatives blamed Zhao Ziyang and the reformers. Although expelled from the Communist Party, astrophysicist Fang Li-Zhi continued to speak out for reform and became a favorite of many foreign journalists. Nicholas Kristof and his Chinese-American wife Cheryl Wudun arrived to take over the New York Times bureau in late 1988.
We knew Fang Li-Zhi. He was one of the first people we met. I liked him a lot, and so we wrote, you know, we wrote about that extensively.
I adored Fang Li-Zhi. Fang was truly independent. He came out of this tradition of physicists and astrophysicists who just saw the world with a certain clarity and felt empowered as individuals to kind of speak the truth. So I thought he was amazing, and he obviously helped inspire students at various universities, including Beijing University, to kind of test the limits.
As 1988 drew to a close, Dorinda Elliott and Adi Ignatius organized a big Christmas party.
We lived in this foreign compound where Chinese who came to visit, they had to pass through guards. It was, for a lot of Chinese, a pretty scary experience, and the guards, you know, often would take their names and ask who they were. And we were just astounded that all these Chinese friends and contacts came, including, and the most exciting, of course, was that Fang Li-Zhi and his wife, Li Shuqian, came. It was this amazing scene where we had a piano, and somebody sat down at the piano and started playing Christmas carols.
We had avant-garde artists, we had the dissident astrophysicist Fang Li-Zhi, you know, all singing Christmas carols.
The whole crowd started singing Christmas carols, including these Chinese and Westerners and everything. It sort of touched upon this moment in China where everything was possible and everything was doable and everything was optimistic.
Deng Xiaoping has repeatedly tried to persuade President
Thank you very much, Mike. By coincidence, a friend was just showing me today a couple of copies of China Daily from the spring of 1989. And it was extraordinary to see even China Daily covering in these almost exuberant terms the student demonstrations. So here I guess we've seen this sort of height of optimism in the mid-late 80s in China. And of course we all know what followed that. So with that, I'd like to throw open the floor for questions for Mike. I think Mike will just stay here at the head of the table and answer questions, and maybe if I can call on you, and please identify yourselves, and they'll bring a microphone to you. Frank. Who would like to go first? Edith, please. She'll bring you a microphone. Here we go.
Hi, Mike. Let's say I was at Business Week in Canada in the mid to late 80s, and often backstopping the Hong Kong Bureau of Business Week that included Dorinda up until 1986. And although you've talked a little bit in the film about, you know, sort of the slow-footed reaction of editors in New York and elsewhere, to me, one of the huge factors at that time was that, I guess, to put it bluntly, the media elite, the leader, the editors who were essentially calling the shots from New York, from Washington, from elsewhere on China were incredibly bullish. And so if you said, well, you know, these partial sort of piecemeal price reforms are having really negative consequences, which was what a lot of economists were saying at the time, Nick Lardy for one, but many others, you just ran into a brick wall. You did not, they did not want to hear that story. They wanted to hear the iconic cover in Business Week was a photo of a kind of dumpy-looking woman in a really raggedy, nasty-looking fur coat, but she was in the, Tiananmen Square. That was a symbol of the new China, and you could not dislodge that image. I know half of these people. I think they were, really forward and doing the right thing. But you did not, in the end, get that picture from the media, from your New York editors.
Push the wrong button here. I'm getting old. No, I think you. I mean, I think it's very clear when you hear what some of these people were saying. I mean, the story of the Time magazine editors bringing the Time news tour to meet Deng Xiaoping and being so impressed that they decided that they wanted to make Deng Man of the Year, and then they said to their Beijing correspondents, well, we've made the decision, now tell us why he should be Man of the Year. And basically they said, well, he shouldn't. The economy's not doing very well, but they were overruled. So I think, it's part of the dynamic of the process. And I think this is true. You can date this back, and those of you who've seen the previous film on the first generation of reporters who opened bureaus in Beijing, this was really true from sort of 79, 80 onwards, that the prevailing image in China was, of China at editorial offices, was generally very upbeat, and the combination of living through the difficulties on the ground in China and then what was happening gave a lot of the reporters a very different perspective. And I think, it was just a kind of permanent tension that you lived with, and people did their best, and I think there's a lot of coverage that mentions the things that were going wrong, but it was the overall sort of atmosphere or context was one in which it was all, very upbeat. And I think the fact that there was that perception at head offices and people who were writing the headlines and assigning the articles is one of the factors that accentuated the degree of disillusionment and bitterness and anger and betrayal when it all went so badly wrong in 1989.
Alan.
Mike, following up a little bit on that, how much access did reporters get at that time to people just below Deng? The people that were actually, you're talking about economic reforms, yes, some weren't successful, but some of them later, Zhu Rongji's and the others who were on their way up, were people talking to them at the time or sort of looking at that?
I think it got better as the decade went on. And there's no question that, it went from very, very little in the early 80s, and then by the mid-late 80s, particularly the reformists were much more open and much more accessible. Not for television. I certainly didn't get anybody serious at a high level, sort of policy level in the first 2 years, 87, 88, up to 89 when I was the bureau chief in Beijing. But I think if you were working for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, or Business Week or Newsweek, you could start talk, particularly the people in the reformist think tanks and so on. So people were getting that kind of access. So you can sort of see how, from Michael Parks saying we were very lucky we got the meeting to some of the People's Daily, to Jim Mann 4 or 5 years later getting somebody to the People's Daily to confirm rumors of internal purges. So it's a kind of incremental process.
Yes, please.
Mike, how come you chose not to include any British or Australian or German or other correspondents who were in China at that time?
Well, I work for something called the USC, U.S.-China Institute, and the part of the mandate of the Institute is to explore issues related to the U.S.-China relationship. So that's one reason. And the second is that this is a broad, the scope of this is already so broad that you could do this project in a dozen different ways. And if you open it up to looking at the British press or the French press or the European, you would just end up being overwhelmed. And so we just made a conscious decision that we were going to limit it to people of whatever nationality who worked for American media organizations. For those reasons, and also because in the grand scheme of things, I think you can make a pretty strong argument that the American media had, to some degree still has, a kind of disproportionate impact, just given the degree to which newspapers around the world had the New York Times syndication service, they got the wires, the networks were sources of video, and so on. So we just had, it's like one of these things you just make a decision. We can only do so much with both the mandate of our institute and the limited resources and people and budget that we had. So it'd be interesting for somebody to look at that for sure, but it just didn't work for us.
One of the things that doesn't come up at that time, which is interesting to me on the rise since, is this what seems to be the appearance of an almost xenophobic nationalism that you didn't see in the man in the street in those days, it seems. I mean, just as a few weeks ago, I was in West Central China, my most recent trip into China, and in an unscripted moment before the local authorities became aware we were there and started wrestling with our videographer and tossed us out of town, just a regular unscripted meeting with somebody, he said, "Do you understand China is a great nation? Do you understand we are a great nation?" It was that kind of a nationalistic tone that you never see or don't hear about. Did you run into anybody in those days who had that tone, or is that really an appearance of the last 20 years that you get people with that kind of aggressive sentiment out in the countryside?
I think it is largely a phenomenon of the last 20 years. I mean, there are lots of reasons for it, but I mean, in the 80s, the theme in China was shaking off all the horrible stuff that had happened, the prospect for better life, and there was, I think, among many people, and particularly among sort of intellectuals and students, a lot of interest in what Western models could do for China, and learning from the West, and Western ideals of more representative government and political, I don't want to say democracy is this kind of catch-all phrase. But I think it's fair to say that after 1989 and into the 90s, as the economy took off and as it became glaringly evident that nobody believed in socialism as an ideology anymore, that to fill that gap that the Communist Party has consciously cultivated this very strong sense of nationalism to sort of replace all that other stuff, and between the failure of the 1989 movement and the attempt to sort of change the historical perception of it and sort of erase the memory of it and to reframe things, the narrative of nationalism but there has always been under the surface this sense of kind of victimization, and China does have a pretty nasty history of a couple of hundred years of being treated very badly by outside powers. But I think that the party has made a conscious decision to cultivate that and portray itself as the standard bearer of that, and then that's coincided with this amazing economic growth, so that they do actually have some muscles to flex at the same time that they reshape the narrative inside China, so more people buy into that. So I don't think I don't have any memories in the 80s of going anywhere and having somebody come up and challenge me. It was much more curiosity about America and goodwill towards America and interest in the outside world. But it was a much earlier stage in this whole, I mean, it's my old camerawoman Cindy's, I never forget this mob of young women in blue jackets and pigtails literally breaking down the doors to get into this makeup exhibition where there were these stalls with Revlon and Elizabeth Arden. They'd never seen it before. That's, it was still news to go to a disco in Beijing. So it was a much earlier stage.
Okay. Well, with that, I think if people have more questions, if they'd like to come up afterwards, then we welcome your questions. We've run later than we usually do, but with something like the Assignment China series, we really do try to give the whole hour, which is later than our usual schedule. And we appreciate everybody. Please, we want you to come back June 3rd. for the Chinamen. We'll have both the main dining room and the veranda here for that occasion. This was a bit of a fluke that we ended up here only on the veranda. It'll be much quieter. You'll have a much better sound quality when we do the next one. We hope to see you all June 3rd. Mike, do you want to make some closing remarks as well?
I just wanted to say, for those of you who didn't see it and are interested, 4 other episodes are available online at our website. If you just Google Assignment China and click on the first link. One on the Chinese Civil War, reporters who covered the Civil War in the 40s, one on China Watchers in the 50s and 60s, one on the press and the Nixon trip, and the one that comes immediately before this on the first generation of journalists who opened bureaus in Beijing, are available online with Chinese subtitles, if those of you have Chinese friends. And eventually, these will also be up there, but it just takes a long time. But please, if you like this, please spread the word, because you know, we're just a little academic institution. So if you like it, put out a tweet with the link to Assignment China. You know, anything to let other folks know that it's out there. And for anybody who's in the world of education who wants a DVD to use in the classroom, let me know, because we make those available.
Okay, and actually we have one last question. Francis just got back, one of our fellow governors here, so I
grabbing his glass of wine.
One more, but
yeah, slipping off there. But you may have already addressed it, so I apologize if I was out at the time. But listening to this very interesting narrative, one question that occurred to my mind was, what was the effect of the stories and the portrayal of China that was coming out over that period of time? Let's just focus on this segment. What impact do you think that had on policy towards China by the United States and perhaps other countries as well?
Well, I mean, someone mentioned earlier this sort of disconnect between editors, you know, media editors and head offices who had this very upbeat view of China, largely because of 2 reasons. One is that China, this is still the Cold War, and China was an ally against the Soviets. And part of it was the narrative of China goes capitalist, they're all drinking Coca-Cola, and, you know, they're interested in rock and roll and all this other stuff, overshadowed these other things. So, you know, I think the extent to which there was negative sort of stuff coming out, it was largely tuned out by policymakers. I mean, they saw China sort of in strategic terms, and they felt, you know, the general. I mean, there's a story when Ronald Reagan went to China in '84. I think he called the Chinese leaders so-called communists. So I think the negative stuff was probably largely tuned out, and the stuff that reinforced that narrative was seized on.
Thank you again very much, and thank you all. And we hope to see you on June 3rd. Thank you.